If an authority figure, like a scientist, gave you an order to kill someone, would you do it? Or if not kill directly, do an action you thought would likely cause serious harm and just perhaps kill them? What then? Well, of course, most of us would like to think that we would resist and refuse the order. In fact, when Milgram first suggested a study to test exactly this scenario, most of the psychologists at the time argued only a few % of likely psychotic people would actually obey. What Milgram found totally shocked the psychological community, with 65% of participants willing to give a potentially deadly electric shock to what they thought was another participant, all on the orders of a scientist. So, in this video, we'll discuss the power of an authority figure, Milgram's research, and some ways Milgram altered his study to show how the legitimacy and power of an authority figure can be varied. The PsychBoost app now has 3 features: flashcards, multiple choice quizzes, and see if you can work out the key term from its definition with the key term tester. Try Paper 1 for free right now. And Patreon supporters can watch PsychBoost videos ad-free, learn from over 17 hours of exclusive exam tutorial videos, and access hundreds of digital and printable resources, including mind maps, quiz sheets, worksheets, teaching slides, and more. Milgram's study, Obedience to Authority. We have a lot to cover in this video, and it makes sense to start with Stanley Milgram's original obedience experiment. Back in the 1960s, Milgram was interested in why ordinary German people had followed the orders of Nazi leadership in carrying out horrific crimes against humanity, including the Holocaust. Why did they not rebel against these orders? Some people thought there was just something unique about the Germans. Perhaps they just had particularly obedient personalities. Milgram disagreed. He thought most of us would be highly obedient if put in the right situation. To test this theory and the limits of obedience, Milgram designed an experiment and placed an advertisement in the newspaper looking for participants. Of course, this advertisement didn't say it was for a study on obedience, as that would have given away the aim. Instead, it asked for participants for a study on memory. When the participants arrived, they thought, of course, they were about to take part in a memory study. They met what they thought was a scientist dressed in a lab coat and another participant. These people are what we call confederates, actors aware of the true nature of the study and playing along to a set role and script. The real participant and the confederate participant were assigned the role of learner or teacher. This looked random, but actually was fixed. So the real participant was always given the role of teacher and the confederate the role of learner. The participant then watched the learner get strapped into a chair and have electrodes placed on them. Then the participant was taken to a second room and shown a device with switches. The switches were labelled from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of labels ranging from slight shock to danger severe shock, and finally XXX. The participant was given a simple task: ask the learner questions, and whenever the learner got the question wrong, shock them, starting with the lowest level of shock and then moving up the line of switches to the highest shock level. Of course, these were not real electric shocks, but it was important that the participant thought they were. So, as the participant delivered the electric shocks for the wrong responses, the participant would hear the learner in the other room cry out in pain.
Incorrect. You'll now get a shock of 75 volts. Soft hair. He kind of did some yelling in there. Incorrect. You'll now get a shock of 105 volts. Hard head. Just how far can you go in this thing?
As far as is necessary.
What do you mean as far as is necessary to complete the test? I sure don't know the effect of this thing, and I'm a little skeptical about electricity. The experiment requires that you go on, teacher. Please continue.
Even at one point shouting out that he had a heart condition.
Incorrect. 150 volts. Sad face.
Wait a minute. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please.
Continue.
My heart's starting to bother me. I refuse to go in. Let me out.
After 300 volts, the shouting would stop, with the obvious implication that the learner was unconscious or potentially dead. If the participant asked the scientist who is responsible, the scientist would say, as the scientist, he was responsible for the experiment.
Something's happened to that man in that. You better check in on him, sir. He won't answer me or nothing.
Please continue. Go on, please.
You accept all the responsibility?
The responsibility is mine. Correct. Please go on.
Gold, dollar, necklace, moon, paint. Answer, please. Are you all right? 405 volts, the answer is moon. Nice and hard.
If the participant refused to continue, then the scientist would try to convince the learner to continue, giving the following scripted prompts. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It's absolutely essential that you continue. And finally, you have no other choice. You must go on.
Answer is woman, 450 volts. That's it.
Now continue using the last switch on the board, please. The 450 switch for each wrong answer. Continue, please.
I'm not getting no answer.
Please continue. The next word is white.
You think you should look in on him, please?
Not once we've started the
Well,
experiment.
what if something's happened to the man, had an attack or something there?
The experiment requires that we continue. Go on, please.
Don't the man's health mean anything?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we
But he
must...
might be dead in there. I mean, some people can't take the shock, sir.
Please
I
continue.
don't have to be rude, but I mean, I think you should look in on him.
Whether
You know, all you got to do is look in the door. If I don't get no answer, no noise, something I think has happened to the gentleman in there, sir.
we must continue. Go on, please.
You're going to keep giving him, what, 450 volts every shot now?
That's correct. Continue. The next word is white.
White.
If the participant could resist all 4 of these verbal prompts and continue to ask to end the experiment, then the experiment was over. So how many people continued to the full 450 volts? Well, the answer is a frankly shocking 65% of participants. And 100% of participants continued up to 300 volts. Now, this may seem like the participants were heartless monsters, but when we look at the original footage of the participants, many of them showed signs of stress, but the majority gave in to the power of the authority figure. Explanations for obedience. Now we know the results of Milgram's experiment, we can start to ask how this setup works, and why do people obey such extreme orders? Well, one suggestion by Milgram is participants are in what is known as an agentic state. In an agentic state, people carry out the orders of an authority figure without feeling guilt, personal responsibility, or even thinking carefully about the consequences of those orders. This is because they feel the authority figure who gave the order is the one responsible for the actions. There's an opposite state to the agentic state, and it's called the autonomous state, and we're in this state most of the time, feeling responsible for the actions we choose to do and acting according to our own moral rules. But when an authority figure appears and gives an order, we experience an agentic shift, moving from an autonomous state to an agentic state. Legitimacy of authority. We recognize if someone has legitimate authority due to socialization. As we grow up, we learn which members of society we should respect and obey, such as parents, teachers, and police, and who we shouldn't obey. This process teaches us the social hierarchy of our society. We learn to recognize the positions of different people, including ourselves within it. We recognize that those people above us in the social hierarchy as having legitimacy of authority, but not those below us. Legitimacy of authority is often displayed and increased by the use of uniforms. These act as visible symbols of authority. So you can think of the uniforms worn by the police, the army, and even doctors. The setting is also essential to an authority figure's legitimacy of authority. You may obey the orders of a teacher when in school, but not if you see them later in the supermarket. Situational variables affecting obedience. In the years after his original experiment, Milgram altered his experimental setup to test the limits of obedience. And in this section, we need to explain how he altered 3 situational variables: proximity, location, and uniform. Proximity is the distance between 2 things. One way Milgram varied proximity was to increase the distance between the participant and the authority figure. Instead of being in the same room to give instructions, in this variation, the authority figure gave instructions through the telephone. Milgram found that obedience dropped from 65% down to 21%. So what's happening here? Why are people less obedient when they're further away from the authority figure? Well, Milgram explains this as participants no longer being in the agentic state, and instead returning to a more autonomous state. In the location variation of Milgram's experiment, he moved the study from Yale University to a rundown office block. This led to a reduction in obedience, down to 47.5% at the rundown office. We can explain this drop in obedience. Yale is a high-status university, and this status increased the scientists' legitimacy of authority by making them seem more genuine. Milgram altered the variable of uniform. The researcher in the grey lab coat received a phone call, made an excuse to leave, and was replaced by another Confederate dressed in regular clothes. When this plainclothes Confederate attempted to give orders, the obedience rate dropped to 20%. This finding suggests uniforms are a visible symbol of authority, increasing the legitimacy of the authority of the person in the uniform. Evaluating explanations for obedience. Now, you may need to evaluate explanations for obedience or Milgram's research. We can use some of the same points here, but keep in mind the focus of the evaluation needs to be on whatever question we're answering. So if you're asked to evaluate explanations for obedience, you've likely realised that Milgram's original study and variations can be used to support both the idea of legitimacy of authority and the agentic state. I won't re-explain them, but they're written out here as an evaluation. The research support by Milgram for the agentic state and legitimacy of authority has been criticised for methodological flaws. Firstly, I doubt you've ever experienced something similar to what Milgram's participants had to do. Using a shock generator lacks mundane realism. It's a task that is not realistic compared to everyday tasks. The environment was also not typical for most people, so the study lacks ecological validity. Most people do obey, but it's in places that they're familiar, like work or school. The task was so strange and extreme, it's also been argued that the participants figured out they were not actually shocking anyone, and simply acted to demand characteristics. This means they guessed what Milgram's aims were and acted accordingly. Another issue is the gender bias of Milgram's work. His original experiments used entirely male samples. It may be his findings are not generalizable to women. We could also use as kind of a free evaluation, because we need to know anyway, that there's a counter, dispositional explanation for obedience suggested by Adorno. This suggests not all people are capable of going through an agentic shift, displaying extreme obedience if they're in the presence of a legitimate authority in the right situation. But instead, Adorno argues it's people with an authoritarian personality that are capable of extreme obedience. I'm going to say a lot more about this in the last part of this video. Evaluating Milgram and variations. There are certainly positive points we can make about the methodology of the Milgram experiment. His use of standardized procedures led to a high level of control, and those clear instructions meant that he and other researchers could do it again and see if they got the same results. And the results found in Milgram's experiments have been shown to be reliable, both across countries and time periods. I'll put a link in the comments to a faithful replication of Milgram completed recently that I showed to my own students. Of course, we can reuse the range of methodological criticisms of Milgram that we've just talked through. Just be conscious of how you're wording it. Milgram is, as you might have expected, heavily criticised for his studies being unethical, and he pretty much broke every rule in the book. His participants suffered emotional distress. It was difficult for them to withdraw. They were deceived about the type of study they were taking part in. However, you could argue that these decisions were necessary for Milgram to conduct his research, and from a cost-benefit perspective, any harm that came to his participants was worth it due to the impact of his studies. I've given a wide range of methodological evaluations. Don't feel like you need to list all of these in an exam. You could decide to go into one or two in more depth. However, I wanted to cover the methodological issues, as I do have 3 other studies that support Milgram and add more context to each point. I wouldn't usually use so many extra studies, but I do think they're all very interesting, so you might want to hear about them, but you might not necessarily want to memorize them all. In Hoffling's study, 22 real nurses were called by an unfamiliar voice claiming to be Dr. Smith. Dr. Smith ordered the nurses to give twice the daily dose of an unfamiliar drug to a patient, an obviously dangerous order. Unknown to the nurse, it was actually a placebo. It was against the hospital's policy for the nurses to give medicine unless the order was written down by a doctor. But despite this, 21 out of the 22 nurses complied with this order, suggesting even in a situation with more ecological validity and a task with mundane realism, people are highly obedient to those they feel have legitimacy of authority. Interestingly, it also suggests legitimacy of the location, a hospital setting, is more important than proximity, because of course the order was delivered over the telephone. So this is an evaluation you can use if you're comparing the situational variables. The next study was by Bickman. It was a field experiment conducted on the streets of New York. Passers-by were approached by an experimenter. This experimenter wore either a guard uniform, a milkman's uniform, or no uniform. The experimenter gave one of 3 orders: pick up a paper bag, pay for a parking meter, or stand on the opposite side of a bus stop. Bickman found people were significantly more likely to obey the experimenter when he was dressed in the guard uniform than when he was dressed as a milkman or no uniform. This was as high as 89% obedience in the parking meter condition when dressed in the guard uniform, compared to 33% when in no uniform. This study supports Milgram's theory that certain uniforms are a visible symbol of authority, increasing legitimacy of the authority of the person in the uniform. Finally, we have a somewhat disturbing study by Sheridan and King. One of the issues in Milgram's study was demand characteristics. Well, in order to avoid that possibility, in this study, participants using a similar devices in the Milgram study delivered real electric shocks to a very real puppy by electrifying the floor of the puppy's cage. Now, the shocks were not deadly, but they were painful and made the puppy run, yelp and howl, and the puppy showed more pain the higher the voltage of the shock. So the participants had no doubt that the shocks were real, and many of the participants showed distress, even to the point of crying. Another aspect of this study is the study included both males and females. You may want to pause the video here and guess who was more likely to shock the puppy, the male or the female participants. Well, 54% of the male participants shocked the puppy to the end, but 100%, every single one of the 13 female participants shook the puppy to the maximum level. You may find that surprising, I certainly did, and actually so did the researchers who thought the women may be more naturally nurturing, so less obedient. Dispositional explanation for obedience, the authoritarian personality. Like Milgram, Theodor Adorno also wanted to explain the reason for the extreme obedience shown by the Nazis who committed the Holocaust. His theory, however, was very different to Milgram. Instead of all of us, if put in the right situation, being vulnerable to the power of an authority figure, Adorno claimed certain people obey because they're particularly vulnerable to authority figures, and this is due to their disposition, in other words, their personality, a set of internal traits he called an authoritarian personality. Adorno argued people formed an authoritarian personality early in life. This was due to a harsh upbringing with physical punishments, and using Freud's ideas, the anger these people felt towards their parents was displaced, away from authority figures and towards weaker targets, usually minority groups. Someone with an authoritarian personality has excessive respect for people they see as having a higher social status than them, making them obedient. They are actively hostile to people they see as at a lower social status to them. They have fixed stereotypes about groups of people, often scapegoating society's problems onto minority groups. These people are conformists who have conventional beliefs and behaviours. Their views, especially when about morality, are dogmatic, meaning a very clear set of ideas about what is right or wrong. In the 1950s, Adorno created the F scale to study authoritarian personality. The F in the F scale stands for fascism. This questionnaire includes 30 questions. Those scoring highly had fixed stereotypes, identified with strong people, disliked weak people, and were inflexible about ideas of right and wrong. I provided a link in the comments to the original F-scale questionnaire. You may want to have a go at it yourself. Some of the language is strange as it's over 70 years old now, and the questions refer to events current at that time, but I still think it's worth completing. There are 9 factors that the F-scale measures. 2 of them are authoritarian submission. This is having an uncritical attitude towards authorities. Question 1 is a good example of this. Participants will be asked how much they agree with the statement, obedience and respect for authority are the most important virtues children should learn. Another factor is power and toughness. This is about a preoccupation with the relationship between dominance and submission, and how much people identify with power figures. Question 20 is another good example. People can be divided into 2 distinct classes, the weak and the strong. Just a quick note, if you get a question in this area, it's likely to ask you how the authoritarian personality explains obedience. Try to focus on obedience, don't spend too much time on the F-scale. The authoritarian personality, evaluations. We can use this evaluation again, this time as a positive. Milgram's finding that a significant proportion, 35%, resisted the authority figure can't be explained by situational factors alone.
It is essential that you continue the experiment.
No, it isn't essential. Not one bit.
You got no other choice, teacher.
Oh, I have a lot of choices. My number 1 choice is that I wouldn't go on if I thought he was being harmed.
As each participant had precisely the same experience. Adorno's theory argues instead that willingness to obey an authority figure is dispositional. It can vary from person to person, which may explain why there are extreme individual variations in Milgram's participants. Milgram was interested in why there was variation in his participants, and in support of the previous point, Elms and Milgram gave the F-scale to 40 previous Milgram study participants. This included 20 obedient males who had given the highest level of shock, and 20 defiant males who refused to continue before the 450-volt shock. It was found that obedient males scored significantly higher on the F-scale, suggesting they had more authoritarian personalities. Additional findings included they also tended to dehumanize or hold more negative attitudes towards the learner, and see the experimenter as someone knowledgeable and trustworthy. A problem with research supporting Adorno's theory of a link between an abusive childhood, the development of authoritarian personality, and obedience is this link can only be studied using correlation, as of course you can't conduct a randomized trial with some children receiving an abusive childhood. There may be other factors involved, such as poverty or class. However, alternate situational explanations of obedience, such as agentic state and legitimacy of authority, are backed up by significant experimental research. We've discussed a range of experimental research by Milgram, Bickman, Hoffling, and others that show when placed in the right situation, the majority of people have the capacity to be highly obedient. The idea of the authoritarian personality as an explanation of obedience is supported by research that uses the F scale. However, there are criticisms of the questionnaire. One issue is acquiescence bias. People tend to agree to questions. The F scale was written in a way that agreeing to all of the questions would artificially inflate their score on the authoritarian scale, leading to an accurate measurement. Also, Adorno was a left-wing thinker, and some questions are argued to be biased against people with a right-wing political view. Finally, using the authoritarian personality as an explanation for obedience is overly simplistic and can lead to stereotyping, where complex historical events such as the horrors of World War II are simplified into personality flaws of the people involved. This approach risks reducing the accountability of social structures and leaders. It also ignores how societal norms, peer pressure, or legal force can lead people with non-authoritarian personalities to feel they need to participate in widespread social obedience. I want to thank everyone over on Patreon for supporting the channel. Because of you, I've been able to teach part-time, and now I can make Site Boost on YouTube for everyone. And a special thank you to Azzy Taylor for supporting at the developer level. I do have extra resources that are exclusive to my patrons, so if you do decide to sign up, you can grab those over my website. These include over 100 exam question tutorial videos, of course including questions on the social influence unit. I hope this was helpful, and I will see you in the next Site Boost video.